There are many different reasons why people play games. Some like digging deep into mechanics and mastering gameplay systems. Some like having a sandbox where they can create or destroy to their imagination's content. Some like taking part in a story and having the opportunity to influence the events of that story. Some people even like Fortnite. But for some, just the promise of being dropped into another world and left to soak up the atmosphere and tone is compelling enough. Of course, not every game needs to have deep mechanics, an involving story, and a big sandbox. A game doesn't need to do everything well to be worth your time. It just needs to do something well. And when a game does something well, and especially when it does something that no other game does quite like it can completely make up for the game's deficiencies in other areas. I can think of a few unusual games that have their lackluster gameplay totally saved by their sense of humour and unique style. Let's be honest, nobody's ever played Deadly Premonition to enjoy the shooting mechanics. And that's fine, because it's a game you play for the story, the characters, and the comfy atmosphere. You can look past the boring combat and side quests, because the game has enough unique elements to still be worth seeing. Well, unique to games anyway. Other games dispose entirely of the bits that don't work, and can be so laser focused on a certain element that that element is the game. Hollow Knight is a game that has boss fights, sure, but Furi is a game that is boss fights, and it throws everything else to the wayside. A lot of AAA games have original ideas somewhere in them, but for one reason or another end up compelled to include whatever the current mass market gaming trend is. On the surface, Noire is a game where you play as a detective and solve crimes through logical deductions. When you play it, you'll discover that it's also a game with third-person shooter sections which force you to kill way more people than any criminal you actually apprehend. The concept I'm dancing around with these examples is the idea of what a game is about. That's a deceptively difficult thing to define, but I think most people will know what I'm getting at here. I mean the main experience that you take away from a game, the essence of it that you will gush about to convince your friends to play it. In short, it's the thing that makes the game the game. Take the third-person shooting completely out of Noire and it would still be Noire, but take out the detective work and it wouldn't be. When you boil a game down to the essence of what it's really about, you can look at the parts that don't contribute to that essence and ask yourself what else they're bringing to the table. Because, like in Noire, when a game has lengthy sections where the player is doing stuff that the game isn't really about, that can be a problem. When a game can't seem to decide for itself what it really wants to be about, well... Enter Paradise Killer, an open-world murder mystery game where you explore a huge vaporwave-inspired island covered with insane architecture and eldritch statues, gathering evidence in preparation for a climactic trial where you're free to accuse any of the eccentric characters of murder or worse. And if that overly long sentence sounded at all interesting to you, then pause this video right now and go and play the game, because that is a true sentence that describes Paradise Killer in the best possible light. Are they gone? Okay. Here's another true sentence. In Paradise Killer, you travel from point to point in the open world, checking off a list of collectibles given to you at the start, and when you're done, or if you get bored halfway through, you go to the finishing area and the game ends. That might sound harsh, so I want to be clear that I enjoyed my time with Paradise Killer, and I absolutely think it's worth playing. Any complaints I make in this video, I make because I was a bit disappointed by a few things in the game, and very disappointed by one thing in particular, and I feel like this kind of game could be massively elevated by addressing those issues. Keep both of those true sentences in mind going forward, because the contrast between them is my main problem with the game, and it's gonna come up again, and again. Paradise Killer is set in a strange and original world inhabited by capricious and constantly warring eldritch gods and demons, alien cosmic horrors drawn from the vastness of space. At some point, a human organization called the Syndicate, founded to worship and serve these gods, was granted the divine power of one of the gods that was about to be killed. With that power, the Syndicate constructed the Reality Folding Drive, a device capable of outputting more than a nuclear bomb's worth of energy each second, and used it to create the first island sequence, essentially another reality, handcrafted by Syndicate architects that took the form of a paradise-like island, complete with temples for worshipping the gods and several pyramids meant to serve as houses for the gods to inhabit, the final goal of the Syndicate being to house all the gods within their reality in order to better worship and serve them, I guess. In addition to the Syndicate, the island was inhabited by thousands of citizens kidnapped from the real world, basically normal people with normal lifespans that are forced to worship the gods in the island's temple through daily bloodletting rituals. The Syndicate is led by a smaller group called the Council, and all Syndicate members have undergone gene therapy to make them functionally ageless and immortal, by the way. Eventually, something led to the downfall of the first island sequence, so it was abandoned, and the Syndicate moved on to the second island sequence in a brand new reality, sacrificing all the first island's citizens in one final orgy of blood before kidnapping new ones for the second island. This cycle of repeatedly constructing and moving to a new island when the current one collapses has happened many times, with different causes for each downfall. Sometimes demons invade and corrupt the island, sometimes a Syndicate member betrays the group or becomes deceived and controlled by a god. But hey, at least they have air conditioning. If this setting sounds absolutely batshit insane to you, then good, thanks for paying attention. The story of the game begins on the final night of the 24th island sequence, when the player's character, Lady Love dies, the investigation freak exiled to the Idle Lands for eternity as punishment for being deceived by a god, is called out of exile to solve an unprecedented case that only she can be trusted to tackle, the murder of the entire council. As the unfortunate ordinary citizens of Island Sequence 24 were giving their final blood samples, and the Syndicate members were partway through being transported one by one to the next island, somebody got into the council chambers and took out the council. Everybody left on the island is a suspect. You can explore wherever you want in search of answers, and it's up to you to decide when the truth has been found. Welcome to Paradise Killer.
Paradise Killer.
It's hard to overstate how successful this introduction feels when you see it for the first time. I happily spent a few minutes here soaking up the atmosphere and inspecting the crazy imagery around me, and that jump from the tower is so stylishly executed that it brought a smile to my face every time I played through it. It's hard not to stay here a while and just admire the island from above. These are the things that Paradise Killer seems to do effortlessly well, although I'm sure a lot of effort was put into these environments and their presentation, and this is where the game really excels. The visuals of Paradise Killer are consistently surprising and mind-bending. Discovering the details of the setting and history of the characters is easily as rewarding as discovering the truth of the central mystery, and that mystery itself is a pretty intriguing one as well. Unfortunately, this intro also offers a glimpse of Paradise Killer's fatal flaw. During this intro, you'll learn everything you need to know in order to play the game. You'll speak to your first NPC, the sarcastic demon Shinji. You'll become familiar with the controls and the basics of gameplay. You can walk, sprint, jump, and interact with certain key items and collectibles. You'll also be introduced to the hacking minigame that gets you through most of the locked doors on the island. There are a couple of optional movement abilities to unlock later, but the gameplay doesn't really change much for the rest of the runtime. I'm not going to complain about the movement controls because Paradise Killer is a narrative game first and foremost, and the controls are suited just fine for that. I'm also not going to complain about the minigame, because it doesn't matter that it's just a simple picture matching game. I think it's only there to provide some context for the hacking, so it doesn't need to be anything more complex. And in fact, it's probably a good thing that it can be done quickly. I'm also not going to complain about the collectibles, because I mostly enjoy the little microfiction stories they provide when you pick them up. The complaint I do have about Paradise Killer's gameplay is something that you won't notice yourself this early into a first playthrough. But in hindsight, it is kind of conspicuous that something is missing from this tutorial. And the reason it's missing from the tutorial is because it's also missing from the game. I'm sorry for the tease, but I think it's a bit too early to get into exactly what it is just yet, because at this point you'll still be basking in the atmosphere and enjoying the game's mood. After you're dropped down from the idle lands, you can open a container and grab your first blood crystal. Blood crystals serve as the island's currency, and they're needed for some essential upgrades as well as some optional bonuses, although of course you won't know that just yet. You can also see another collectible hidden behind a locked door with a conspicuous wire leading away from it, which will probably clue you in that exploration is sometimes required to unlock certain areas. After that, all that's left to do here is speak to Lydia Daybreak, the first suspect you interact with and the island's ferry woman. It's clear from their chat that Lydia and Lovedies were old friends before her exile. After the journey to the courthouse, we finally speak to Judge, the arbiter of justice on the island, and get the full details of the crime we're investigating. The council went into their chamber for a final meeting on the last night of Island Sequence 24, but didn't come back out. Around midnight, the last remaining citizen on the island, the demon-possessed Henry Division, broke free of his imprisonment and was found outside the council building with the blood of the council both in his stomach and on the blade of the knife he stole. It seems like a simple cut-and-dry case, but maybe it's a little too simple. It's been impossible to confirm the truth of the matter because this is a locked room murder where the room is still locked. See what I mean? Pretty intriguing, huh? The council chambers are secured behind 4 holy seals, the first of which are 2 highly trained guards posted at the entrance to the council building, and the last 3 of which are mysteries known only to the council members. Judge also informs you that the Syndicate's craftsman, KHX, has been missing for several days, a disappearance which may or may not be related to the Council's murder, especially considering that he was responsible for the creation of the second Holy Seal and knows its secret. Lovedie's trusty laptop, Starlight, will give you a checklist of leads to follow up on and questions to think about, and it will also categorize the evidence you find according to its related suspect and the related crime. And this is the moment where the game lets you off the leash, and you're free to go and do whatever you want, which makes now as good a time as any to start talking about the game's open world. As you start running around and exploring, you'll discover that there are a few things made possible by that open world. The ability to gather evidence and talk to suspects in any order is probably the biggest selling point, but a world where you can explore freely needs to give you a reason to do so. So this is also where the game's collectibles and the blood crystal currency come in. Both can be found dotted around the island, although the collectibles tend to be found in places related to the micro-stories they contain. One other kind of collectible, the best in the game in my opinion, is the music tapes you can find, which unlock new tracks you can listen to while you walk around. I was always excited to find one of these. Sooner or later you'll come across a nightmare computer terminal that you're not equipped to access yet, and you'll discover that there actually is a progression system to this game, in the form of upgrades to your laptop Starlight. So here's where the currency comes in, because 2 of the 3 upgrades for Starlight require spending blood crystals to unlock, and you get blood crystals by exploring the island, and sometimes for finding certain collectibles and inserting them into statues or reliefs. In this way you advance through the game's progression system naturally, gaining the potential to access new areas the more you explore. In fact, for one of the upgrades, you not only need to use blood crystals, but you need to insert them into a certain number of vending machines around the island, which I think proves my point about the intent being to encourage and reward exploration. As well as using them to purchase upgrades, you can also use blood crystals to buy dirt on suspects from the island's information broker Crimson Acid, who happens to sell one of the laptop upgrades as well. And finally, blood crystals are used to unlock and then use fast travel points littered around the island. One to unlock a location, and then another one to actually travel. Unfortunately, and I'm sorry to be getting negative about the open world so early, I'm not a big fan of this currency system. In my first playthrough I had absolutely no idea how rare or how valuable these blood crystals were, so I avoided spending them on fast travel points for the first half of my playthrough, and I also stayed away from the vending machines because I assumed they were just for fun, and I didn't know they were necessary for progression. When I later found out from Crimson Acid that they were the key to one of the upgrades, I had to go back through the areas I'd already explored to find them again. Now, I'm willing to say this is my fault and not the game's, but I think it's natural for players to avoid doing something when they don't know what the consequences will be. After you buy your first drink from a vending machine, the mascot, Dead Nebula, calls you on your codec to tell you about the upgrade, so my problem could have been solved by just having Dead Nebula inform you about the upgrade before you have to spend any blood crystals. In any case, by the end of the game you'll probably have upwards of 30 or 40 blood crystals going spare after purchasing everything important, so my caution was unwarranted in the end. And once you have purchased everything important, the only thing left to spend your blood crystals on is fast travel, which you can use to avoid having to traverse the open world. I don't have an issue with the game including fast travel, but the fact that it uses resources irks me a little bit. I know that you'll almost certainly finish the game before you can run out of crystals, but the fact that a service you could potentially want to use an infinite number of times requires a resource that only exists in a finite amount just feels wrong to me, and taken to its logical conclusion would end up punishing the players who spend the most time in the game by eventually removing their ability to fast travel. One last thing to mention regarding the open world is that the game aids your navigation by letting you hold a button to see the locations of all suspects. They each stay in one spot throughout the game, but this makes it easier to find them, and they also get an exclamation mark next to their icon when they have new dialogue options. I also need to mention that there's one other kind of progression gate in the game, in the form of the relationship level you have with each suspect. When you first talk to a suspect, in addition to the investigate option, you can also choose to hang out, which gives the game a chance to dish out some backstory and character building. There are dialogue options here, where sometimes you can choose between flattering and angering certain characters, but I never saw this make a difference outside of the dialogue itself. The relationship stat always seemed to go up either way. This can feel a little bit weird because once the stat hits a certain level, that character will ask to confide something in you, giving you the probe option, where they usually drop the dirt on a different character. I have a lot more to say about the consequences of all of the game's systems, but for now let's stop talking about the open world and actually start traversing it. Leaving the courthouse, you really can go in any direction you choose, so to keep this video from becoming a walkthrough, I'm just going to summarize what the goal of the game is from this point on. Mostly you'll be speaking to every character, returning to the ones that have new dialogue options, and picking up bits of evidence around the island. Starlight keeps a log on each suspect, keeping note of their alibi, motive, and any evidence that breaks their alibi and implicates them. These alibi breaker smoking guns tend to be hidden behind progression gates like upgrades, presumably to make sure they're among the later pieces of evidence you'll come across. Starlight also keeps a separate log for each crime committed leading up to the murder, the breaking of each of the 4 holy seals for example, and categorizes evidence for each crime according to which suspect it implicates. Generally, each crime will end up with one suspect having more evidence against them than anyone else. But as you explore and collect evidence, you may notice that the game doesn't actually ask you to do anything with it. When you hear a suspect's alibi, or find a clue that may implicate somebody, it's automatically categorized without your input. Finding KHX's workshop and examining it might be the best example I can give of the game's investigation mechanics, or lack of them. You walk around the workshop, interacting with everything that's highlighted, filling up your journal with evidence, and then you jump off a cliff when you're ready to leave. And that little section more or less serves as a vertical slice of the remainder of the game. Although it's on a larger scale, what you do on the island is walk around interacting with everything that's highlighted until your journal is full of evidence. I'm pretty sure the game actually expects you to blindly interact with everything you see, because at one point it's necessary to move the investigation forward. In order to get into the barracks and check the records for evidence, you first need to cause a distraction for the guards. I had no idea this was what the game wanted from me, so I spent a while entering the barracks, getting caught and trying again, thinking it might be a stealth section that I was just failing, before I eventually gave up and went somewhere else. Imagine my surprise when later on the other side of the island, I turned a random valve that I was interacting with just because it was highlighted, and suddenly the game told me I'd successfully caused a distraction and could now sneak into the barracks. After this, the game dealt a final blow to my expectation that I would actually have to use any of the evidence I was collecting in the open world. There are multiple points where you can come across incredibly damning evidence that basically proves beyond doubt that somebody is guilty, but if you take it to them and confront them with it, they'll simply deny everything. I was expecting to be rewarded for figuring something out and making an accusation, but the game takes the wind out of it in two ways. One, by showing you an exclamation mark next to their icon that tells you they have new dialogue options, making a deduction that could have been your own into just another item on the checklist, and two, by making the accusation itself completely pointless. I've just shown this character absolutely irrefutable proof of their guilt. They should know at this moment that they are 100% totally and completely fucked, and yet they simply deny everything and say something like, "I guess we'll find out in the trials." Being rebuffed with such a basic denial is deflating at best, and confusing at worst when it makes you question whether or not you've misunderstood something. Almost every character that you can confront with evidence of their wrongdoing does this, which gave me the expectation that it would pay off when I finally did get to present my evidence and expose them in the trials. The trials that take place at the end are the climax that the game is building towards, where you make your accusations and see justice carried out. But it's more complicated than that, because the open world nature of Paradise Killer means that you can not only go in any direction from the beginning, you can also choose for yourself when you want to end the game, which made it really hard to structure writing about it. I'm in two minds about this decision from the devs, because on the one hand it's definitely contributing to the whole make your own truth thing that the game is going for, and is an essential part of the freedom this game gives to the player. On the other hand, however, in practice there's simply no reason to begin the trial early unless you were just bored with the game. Since you're given a checklist of questions to answer and things to investigate, I don't think it's really possible to miss anything by accident. You'd have to be deliberately commencing the trial without collecting all the evidence, and I just don't see why anybody would choose to do that. The game certainly doesn't give you any reason to. Like I said, heading into the trial, I was excited to see how the game was going to test me on my understanding of the evidence I had collected. So imagine my immense disappointment when it just doesn't do that at all. For each of the crimes on trial, the breaching of each holy seal, the murder of the council, the disappearance of KHX, and a few others, you're allowed to accuse one person who will be executed by Love Dies if found guilty. Once you make your accusation for each crime, your input is essentially over, meaning that in reality your only input was whether you spent long enough collecting things in the open world. You're never asked to use specific pieces of evidence to counter alibis or make points. Love Dies just goes through a list of what she's discovered, and that really is it. In a mystery or detective game, knowledge should be the most powerful thing you can have, but in Paradise Killer, evidence and information are no different to all the other collectibles you throw in your bag. Assuming you've collected every piece of evidence, and again the game gives you no reason not to do this, each crime's case file will have one suspect with more evidence against them than anyone else. In pretty much every case, this suspect is the guilty one. There's one exception to this, which is bad for a different reason, although I'll have to spoil a minor mystery to explain it. Your notes on the disappearance of KHX will have more evidence against Crimson Acid than anyone else, although Yuri Knight is the one actually responsible. This isn't a case of a clever deception or an attempt at framing Crimson by another character or anything like that. It's simply that the game chooses to give you more circumstantial evidence against Crimson Acid, which feels more like the game unfairly misleading the player than anything else. I'm still not 100% sure it's fair of me to criticize the game for something that it doesn't do, because if the devs never meant for the game to be about that missing element, then they shouldn't be negatively criticized for not including it. On the other hand, the game really gave me the impression that it was going to ask me to use evidence to state my arguments and make a case against my chosen culprits. In other words, that I was going to have to actually do some investigative reasoning. In other words, that it was going to be like Danganronpa. I've tried to avoid it so far, but comparing this game to Danganronpa is practically unavoidable. It has a murder taking place amid a bizarre cast of characters, an investigation phase where you collect evidence and talk to suspects, and culminates in a dramatic trial where you make your accusations. And just like a certain series starring a monochrome bear, it has 2D character art overlaid on a 3D world. Each Danganronpa game has you go through a series of murders, with each having a linear investigation phase in which you pretty much just interact with everything and collect evidence. Going into the trial for each murder, you won't have enough information yet to figure out the culprit, so there's still some tension in knowing that you're going to have to pay attention to the discussion and use the facts you've collected to make deductions and expose contradictions. And that's exactly what you end up doing. The Danganronpa class trials test you on your logical reasoning and force you to prove you've figured out what happened in each murder. Let's compare to Paradise Killer. The investigation phase also involves interacting with everything to collect evidence, but instead of a linear story-led search, you're free to question anybody and go wherever you like, progression gates notwithstanding. Once you've collected everything, it's not hard to piece together for yourself what happened leading up to the council's murder, and you'll likely be going into the trial already knowing the full truth. Whereas in Danganronpa, you're still in the dark and still feel the pressure of the unknown. In Danganronpa's trials, you need to use logical reasoning to refute or support what the other characters are saying with the evidence you've collected, whereas in Paradise Killer, there are no gameplay decisions to be made or logical challenges to overcome in the ending trials, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you what a letdown that was. To the game's credit, there are decisions to be made in these trials, in the form of who you choose to accuse of each murderous ruse. But you can disabuse yourself of the notion that this will have any meaningful impact. I get it, the idea behind the trials is that you've already solved the case and now you're just deciding who goes down for it. So here is where you get to choose whether to pin it all on the kingpin and let the less guilty go free, or see everyone involved pay with their lives. There's no penalty for getting anything wrong, and if you accuse someone without any evidence collected against them, judge will refuse to deem them guilty and just move on to the next case. Which is fine, I'm not advocating for a fail state during the trial if you get something wrong, since that would grind against the dev's intention of player freedom. But since you go into the trial already knowing the truth, there aren't really any interesting choices or revelations to be made in the trial itself. And I'm sorry for the potentially unfair comparison, but this is just nowhere near as compelling as the trials in Danganronpa. And look, I've realised that it would have been an immense amount of work to write responses for every possible player choice in these final trials, but some of the obvious choices that many players are likely to see had a jarring lack of dialogue to them. It just felt completely out of character for Loved Eyes to mercilessly execute Lydia and Sam after accusing them, her oldest friends gunned down without so much as a word. And if you decide to pin everything on Henry, the citizen set up to take the fall for the crime, then most other characters stay completely silent throughout the entire trial. If the point was to make it a difficult choice which characters to brand as guilty and innocent, then it's also a shame that most of these choices, with one exception, are no-brainers, since the friendly characters are the innocent ones and the dickheads are the guilty ones. And after your accusations have been made, all of this is undercut by the fact that after the trials have concluded, you're given free rein to run around the island and execute or exile any remaining characters as you see fit. Again, this is consistent with the game's apparent goal of total player freedom, but it takes away from the importance of the trial, and it really takes away from the importance of any evidence gathering you've spent the majority of the game doing. This laser focus on player freedom is a large part of what makes Paradise Killer stand out as a unique experience, but I'm gonna argue now that it's also the source of the game's biggest flaw. While Paradise Killer gives the player the freedom to go everywhere and discover everything, and the freedom to end the game at any point they choose, it doesn't give the player a single reason to begin the trial early. It doesn't give the player a reason not to hang out with every character, and it doesn't give the player a reason not to collect every piece of evidence. But what if it did? What if there was some kind of cost to each choice you made about who to question, where to investigate, and which lines of inquiry to prioritize? What if the game gave the player a time limit, or some other resource like activity points which ticked down every time the player did something significant? Suddenly the investigation would have stakes, and the choices you made about where to go and who to interrogate would be meaningful, rather than just choosing which order you tick off your checklist. This idea makes so much sense to me that I have to wonder if it was once a part of the game, that got scrapped during development. If that's true, then I completely understand the decision to remove it, since having to play on a timer and repeat content by starting again when that timer runs out can turn a lot of people off playing a game. But the fact remains that so many parts of this game begin to make more sense once you imagine they have some kind of cost attached to them. What if hanging out with one character meant you didn't have time to hang out with another? What if characters could deliberately mislead you with false leads to get you to waste your precious time before the trial started? Some pieces of evidence you can find tell you something you already know, which is pointless if you're collecting everything anyway. But what if you actually had to present evidence in the final trials, and you could use multiple facts to make the same point? Then it wouldn't matter if you collected everything, and it would give the devs the chance to make it so that you couldn't collect everything. Much is said in the dialogue of Paradise Killer about the need to find your own truth, and yet your truth will look the same as every other player's once you've collected all the evidence. If you only had the time to collect a certain amount of evidence before the trial began, then your truth really would end up looking different to everyone else's. I think the paradoxical bush I'm beating around here is that in order for freedom to be meaningful in a game like this, you can't actually be free to do everything, because the result is that, sadly, Paradise Killer ends up as a game where there are almost no interesting choices to make. Not in the dialogue, not in the open world, and just barely in the final trial. So here at the end is where that question of what the game is supposed to be about rears its ugly head. Is Paradise Killer supposed to be a game about solving a murder mystery, or a game about exploring an original vaporwave environment and experiencing a story about a murder mystery? Well, you need to find your own truth to answer that question, but there's actually a line of dialogue in the game that I think addresses this issue directly. When you pick up one of the laptop upgrades from a vending machine, the mascot Dead Nebula calls you to inform you that you have to go into the inventory and install it before it can be used. Love Dies comments that it feels like an unnecessary step, and Dead Nebula replies that it's the friction that makes things meaningful. Paradise Killer is a game that is full of friction. In the collectibles, in the gigantic open world, in the nightmare computers and the progression gates, in the evidence hidden behind each character's relationship stat. All of these details provide context and enrich the world's feel and atmosphere, but they don't really contribute anything at all to the investigative gameplay, and there isn't very much of that to begin with. For a lot of its runtime, Paradise Killer is that friction, and if the setting and characters aren't doing it for you, you likely won't find anything else to make up for that. How much friction you're willing to accept depends on you. If you go into the game expecting to experience a story in an original setting with interesting characters and a unique narrative, then it will absolutely succeed. You might even be able to justify the excessive collectibles by saying that they encourage exploration of the game's unique world, which would make sense if that was the point of the game. If, on the other hand, you're expecting the game to be about using logical reasoning to discover the truth of a murder case, then you'll be disappointed that the game never asks you to do that, and all of the trinkets lying around will end up feeling like paradise filler.
Nice.
Even though I just killed the club with that savage line, I don't want to end on an excessively negative note because I honestly really enjoyed the game, and I would recommend it to anyone on the fence. This video has mostly been a critique of the gameplay mechanics that disappointed me, but there's so much else to love about Paradise Killer. The music, the visuals, the story and characters all come together to create a one-of-a-kind vibe that more than deserves its overwhelmingly positive rating on Steam. And just as I implied at the beginning of this video, it's easy to overlook the shortcomings in gameplay when you're busy savouring those other fantastic elements. The world of Paradise Killer is one of the more intriguing environments I've seen in a game, and seeing it all from up on that tower at the beginning still makes me smile at the obvious amount of passion that went into creating it. I just can't shake the feeling that Paradise Killer makes a promise that its gameplay never fulfills.